Okay, it is 1 minute past midday, so I will get started on this city's outlook deep dive for the Northwest. Right, so I'm going to talk you through city's outlook with a particular focus on our Northwest cities. For context, it was looking at how you raise living standards across urban Britain in light of the government's economic mission to raise incomes and living standards all across the country. My name is Rob Johnson. I'm a senior analyst, done a lot of the analysis for this, so I'll take you through some of the details here. And then there'll be roughly 10 minutes at the end for any questions that might come up. So I'll start talking about cities. Britain is urban, as you can see here, a minority of the land, but more than half the population and almost two-thirds of the UK economy, and even greater concentrations of the generators of prosperity, things such as our high knowledge, technical service jobs. And so any government wanting to focus on raising living standards across the country has to focus on UK cities. It cannot achieve its mission without that focus. But I'll start by giving you a picture of what the lay of the land is in terms of living standards. Now, we focus on disposable incomes here, so that is the amount of money per person left over after things such as taxes and transfers, with which people can spend on things to materially raise their standards of living, whether that be housing, groceries, leisure, etc. So this is the distribution, and I've highlighted here in pink cities in the northwest. Now, what you can see there is a big variation across the country. Take Blackburn at the bottom there, it has roughly half the disposable incomes per head than London at the top. And northwest cities relatively spread out among cities in the rest of the UK. You've got Warrington there at the top, places like Preston, Manchester, Wigan towards the middle, and Burnley and Blackburn at the bottom. So there's variation in living standards across the country, and the overall gap between greater southeast cities and the rest of the UK, including cities in the northwest, is greater southeast cities have about 40% higher incomes than the rest of urban areas in the UK. Now, if that spread seems familiar, it's because that's exactly the position we were in 2008 on the eve of the financial crisis. Same variation, same disposable income levels, and same gap between Greater Southeast and the rest of the country. And it is no different for cities in the Northwest. As you can see, across the board, these cities have living standards pretty much in the place where they were almost 20 years ago. And that's in real terms. So that's after accounting for inflation. And this kind of hammers home why the government has this mission to raise living standards everywhere across the country. Now, the other aspect of that is not just, they want living standards to be felt rising everywhere, it's to be felt by everyone. And actually, what you can see here is that if you plot disposable income per person on average across UK cities against the share of neighbourhoods in the top fifth most deprived neighbourhoods in each city, there's a clear relationship there. Lower average disposable incomes, higher concentrations, pockets of deprivation. So again, all the northwest cities are labelled there. You get a spread across levels of deprivation. You've got Blackburn there at the top. More than half of its neighbourhoods are in the top 20% most deprived, income deprived in the country. But you've also got relatively high levels in Burnley and Liverpool. And then more towards the bottom, you've got Preston, Warrington, the only cities in the northwest that have below average levels of income deprivation. But overall, what this tells you is that everywhere and everyone part of the mission, they're one and the same thing in most cities and most cities in the northwest. In order to, share proceeds around more widely, you need to raise average incomes. You need to increase the size of the economic pie in the first place. So I want to give you a bit background on how we got here, just because, it's informative of, where economic growth comes into this and what its relationship is with disposable incomes, with living standards. And we can start by looking at before the financial crisis, where every city, marked by the dots here, was having economic growth and accompanied with rising incomes. So I've highlighted Liverpool there as a city that was pretty typical of the period, roughly 3% economic growth per year and 2.5–3% disposable income growth over the period. Now, that all came to a halt after the financial crisis. Economic growth stagnated, went into reverse in some places, and disposable incomes declined everywhere, and Liverpool was no exception. You see falling disposable incomes for the city in that period. I think what this goes to show is that growth and long-term growth is a necessary component for rising incomes. You've got to have that pie increasing for people's incomes to rise. Now, what looks different in the period after the aftermath of the financial crisis, that, a decade of slow and uneven recovery, you get some return to economic growth. So Liverpool, in growth terms, is back to its relative position as it was in the pre-crisis period. Now, slightly lower levels, but still there. But what you don't see is a return to rising living standards. You see that flattening of the relationship. There's become a disconnect between economic growth and rising living standards. Now, some of that is just not enough growth, not as much as we had in the pre-crisis period, but there's been an extra disconnect that we want to investigate further. So what I'll do next is just zoom in on that cluster, on those green dots there, and we can look at how places have performed on economic growth and incomes growth, on living standards growth, relative to the national average. So the averages are shown by that cross in the middle there. It's divided into 4 quadrants. And what we have are, different categories of places. So for instance, in the top left, we've got places like Blackpool, where living standards growth has increased, but in spite of local economic performance rather than because of it. Blackpool is more to do with the fact that it started from a very low base, and it's also surrounded by large regional economies rather than its local economic performance. Bottom left, we've got places that are still sort of trailing the national average, both in terms of growth and disposable income. Burnley and Birkenhead, actually, incomes have declined slightly. Wigan too. And then, what we're more interested in are those in the top right, ones that we've highlighted there, called cities achieving greater prosperity in this period. What they've managed to do is maintain that connection between economic growth and incomes growth, and buck the trend of the kind of relative stagnation of this period. And Northwest has 3 cities in that category. It's got Blackburn up there, Preston and Warrington that has had especially strong economic growth and tied that to rising living standards. And Liverpool and Manchester, they're kind of tuck into places that have seen decent growth and almost kind of performed that UK average living standards growth, but not quite in that top corner there. So, the rest of this is okay. What is determining this performance and living standards? How have places managed to tie it to economic growth? And here we kind of distill it down into 3 ingredients. So I'll take you through those and point out where Northwest cities feature in those categories. So first off, key is having a productive business base. So literally the firms that provide the wages, are the production side of the economy, that bring in money from outside. They trade with the wider region, wider nation, and even in global markets, put money in local workers' pockets, who then go on to spend in local services, and that feeds through into wider living standards. So what this lollipop chart shows is that kind of process of how the productive side of the economy feeds through to living standards. The pink dots there is showing relative to the UK average. This is the share of KIBS jobs. Those are knowledge-intensive business services. They're at the forefront of productivity performance across the UK. The UK has a sort of competitive advantage in that sector. It's the backbone of the industrial strategy. So this is where a lot of your, the strength of your economy comes from. That feeds through into higher productivity, the blue dots, and then higher workplace wages, the green dots, and then onto living standards. So we've grouped cities by those living standards in this chart. And I've just shown you where northwest cities fall into each category. So actually, none of them in the top performers, none sort of beating the national average in terms of living standards, though I'd have to say in that middle chart, there's a bit of variation there. So Warrington is very close to that national average. And actually, if you look at its KIB share of jobs, it's about 24%. That puts it right up there with places like London, Reading, Edinburgh, whereas places like Birkenhead, Blackpool are towards the lower end of that category. But, you even see the big cities, places like Liverpool, Manchester, on average, do have relatively low incomes, even despite their size and despite the decent performance of their city centres, which I'll get into a bit later. But this is the key ingredient: is having the generator of prosperity in your local area, in order for any residents to enjoy living standards. It's got to be the starting step. It's kind of the fundamental ingredient there. But it's not just that. You can have the productive side of your economy, but in order for that to feed through into your residents' living standards, they've got to access that prosperity. Most simple way to think about access is, do they participate in the local economy? Do they have a job in the local economy? And so here, what we're showing is the employment rate. It's the share of working age population in employment. And plotting that against disposable income per person. As you see, it's it's a positive relationship. More people plugged into the local economy, higher average incomes. So here on the highlighted northwest cities, you've got Blackburn there at the bottom again, relatively low employment, low average incomes, and up at the top you've got again Preston and Warrington. Decently high employment rates and the highest, relatively high disposable incomes. And actually Preston and Warrington, if you see by the colours of the dots there, again, the only cities that have neighbourhood income deprivation below the average, and they've got relatively high employment rates. I'd also sort of highlight Liverpool here. Now, it looks like it's maybe not performing as well, but if we think about it across time, it's seen a real improvement in its employment rate. Back in 2013, it would have been rock bottom of all UK cities in terms of employment rate, but there's been a concerted effort to tackle that over the past decade. There's been kind of policy continuity at the city region level. They've managed to tap into central government funding that has plugged right into their kind of long-term skill strategy. It's a real focus on recognizing the local problems in terms of skills and employment, having neighborhood level targeted interventions targeted at the most disadvantaged areas. And you've actually seen a real improvement in that employment rate and corresponding disposable income rises. And actually Liverpool has had the largest decrease in income deprivation of any UK city since 2010. So there's still a long way to go, but I think it's a really good example of one of these places that has performed well over the period since the financial crisis. But it's not just access through participation skills, but there's physical access. Can you actually get to centres of your economy? So what I'm showing you here is Manchester, in case any of you didn't recognize it. The sort of purple splodge in the middle is the area that can reach the Manchester city centre within 30 minutes on public transport. And what has happened with that over the past decade has been a real step up in connectivity. You've seen expansion of the Metrolink system, the introduction of the B network and bringing buses under public control, which, first place to do so outside of London, and there are future plans for rail devolution there. And then that is superimposed over the neighborhood level measures of income deprivation change. So the green places have got better, red places have got worse. And what actually this shows is that the well-connected areas are twice as likely to have reduced their income deprivation in Manchester than those that aren't. But the key is because Manchester city centre has been expanding. It's about a 40% increase in jobs since 2015. So, 1.5 times the size as it was before. And if you look at the composition of jobs in that, the share that are in these knowledge intensive business services, it's indistinguishable from London at this stage. So it shows the importance of access. It is you have to access an economy that is providing something, and then you can share that prosperity more widely. Finally, the third ingredient is easing the kind of constraints to providing high living standards in particularly in successful places. Now, you'd expect, as this graph shows, that higher disposable incomes, you get higher share of spending on housing, but you don't want that to reach unmanageable levels. And actually, I think here for the in the Northwest context, you don't get a lot of places kind of running up against these constraints just as of yet, not like places in the Greater Southeast, but I think it's worth highlighting a place like Warrington, which is competing in terms of its economic performance, its disposable incomes, but it doesn't have those housing constraints compared to somewhere like Reading, Slough. And actually, I'll get into that in a bit as why that is the case. It's been very proactive in making sure that its local economy is not constrained in that area. So I promised more detail on Warrington. Well, here it is. We highlight in the report actually that this is a really good illustration of where these ingredients that I've just talked about come together in order to translate into rising living standards, particularly over a period of relative stagnation. So on the strength of the economy side of things, we've got Birchwood Park there, big industrial site, big nuclear cluster there. It's one of the real strengths of the local economy, but it's not just the fact that Warrington relies on that and nothing else. There's been active moves to try and diversify its business base, move into other high competency, high tech sectors. There's this base development in the city centre looking to sort of build digital and tech capabilities. Then in terms of access, it's been really proactive on the transport side of things. So a lot of investment gone into motorway junctions and highways connecting to its economic centres. There's also providing access for residents to regional opportunities, such as the opening of Warrington West Station. Better plugging in those residents to large labour markets in Liverpool and Manchester. And I think for both of these things, it's worth highlighting that, half of this funding for these projects have come from council borrowing and private sources, as well as just central government grants. So it's kind of active moves to improve these. And then finally, just Warrington has been where it's probably been most active is not making sure that the economy isn't constrained to grow. So you've got expansion of commercial space, Omega Park. There's plans to take advantage of the future Northern Powerhouse Rail improvements to open up a new quarter in the city centre to provide high-grade office space for more high-tech firms and more office-based firms. And then on the housing point, council's been very active in releasing Green Belt provide space for future housing demand, and one of only a few dozen local authorities to have done so over the past couple of years. So, and I think back to the Warrington point, it's just worth highlighting that the cities in our top right category, the ones that have achieved greater prosperity, they come from all across the country. It's not just your usual suspects. And actually, the fact that the three Northwest cities are in that, it provides lessons for the rest of the region, but also the rest of the country. And noting that your starting point doesn't preclude you from, improving and raising living standards in your area. But so I'll talk to it's basically like what if more places had performed like Warrington, like those top right cities in that chart? How much more could local workers have in their pockets if they had, kept that connection between growth and living standards and outperformed the national average? Split it by city here just to see the impacts, but you'd see particularly large effects in Birkenhead, Wigan, where that rising living standards hasn't been seen, and actually that number in proportional terms is high, much higher than already relatively well-off places like Exeter and Aldershot and Cambridge, and then some smaller improvements for the other cities in the northwest. So, that goes back to what our conclusion, what we set out in the report. It's about focusing on these three ingredients, about strength of the local economy, access to employment, transport and skills, and also easing the constraints to growth. So that's a little rundown. I'll just quickly say that you can look at more specific data on the Northwest. We've got our what we call Chapter 3 in our report, which does top 10, bottom 10, some nice visualizations like this one for all cities. So have a look at that. There's a link there. And then the data tool on our website also lets you to customize and look at further data sets, particularly if you're interested in the Northwest. Should highlight a Warrington there. But yeah, it's plenty on our website to look at. Now, I think we've got about 5 minutes for questions. So I'll have a quick look at that. Sorry, I'll stop sharing so I can see the Q&A. No questions as of yet. I think, specific data queries, and, where is my place on the rankings, on the different charts. I think a lot of that can be answered by looking at our Chapter 3 Outlook report and also using our data tool to, uh, you know, pick out those places. Also, if you've got any queries on, um, you know, how do we define cities? Which cities do we choose in order to study? Then that is all on our website. We look at primary urban areas, which is sort of best capturing um, the the built up area of these places. So it's not necessarily what, say, the local council boundaries determine as cities. And so, a lot of those questions will be answered there. For instance, you see Blackpool doing relatively well in a lot of charts. That's because our definition of Blackpool includes some, the neighbouring local authority, which, adds in some slightly better off neighbourhoods. So I've got a question there. There's a methodology section in the report on the website you could briefly discuss. Yes. Well, we talk through the data that we use in the report. I think the main ones we look at are this disposable income measure. So that is taken from the ONS. But what we do is we adjust it to make it as close as possible to a kind of cash measure of disposable incomes, as in literally the cash amount that people have to spend on their material standards of living. The ONS definition at the local authority level, which we use, includes some of these imputed parts of disposable income, which we kind of want to get rid of, so we have a better idea of what those are actually doing. In terms of the data, the indicators we use, yes, in our Outlook report, all the indicators, economic indicators, we put in some notes as to where it comes from and any adjustments we make. So another anonymous question: did the analysis look at the impact of business type in an area? Not beyond just the breakdown between KIBS, knowledge intensive business services. Not in this piece, we've not done such detailed analysis. We've done stuff on that in the past, mainly looking at sort of the productivity performance of different types of businesses in cities. I can let's see if I can send you a link to that. Might be the best way to do that. But yeah, no, this piece we did was sort of more high level, focusing on we know that these KIBS jobs are important in the national economy, so using that as an indicator for strength of local economic performance. Sam Allwood, like some more convincing last statement, economic growth drives improving living standards. Pursuing growth for growth's sake isn't going to affect living standards. I think that's a really good question. I hope that um, I quite liked I'll share the slides again, actually. I quite liked our chart on, oh, no, that has not worked. Anyway, I'll just talk you through it. So our chart on kind of the relationship between economic growth and living standards growth, I thought was quite compelling on that. I think the answer there is that economic growth is necessary, but it's not sufficient for rising living standards. If you think at a basic level, you know, you can't consume more than you produce, not in the long term. And that means that if you've got a kind of economic pie that you're able to share out among residents, that has to be growing if you want to meet your mission of increasing the size of the slice of the pie for everyone. If your pie is fixed, then changing the size of the slices, that someone's going to lose out. And so that's why you need that economic growth as a base level to affect living standards. But what our analysis shows is that it's not sufficient to do it everywhere. And particularly in local economies, you've got this issue of, okay, your local economy might be performing, but are your residents directly benefiting from that? And that's about this kind of, can you keep the connection between that local economic performance and what local residents feel and experience? And that's why we wanted to look into things such as, do they have the right skills to access the labor market? Are they participating in the labor market? Can they get to the centers of their labor market? But yeah, I think, going back to the pre-crisis trend, everywhere had growing, like local economy was growing everywhere, and living standards rising everywhere. As soon as you lose that economic growth, living standards decline. Finally, another anonymous attendee says, disposable income might feel quite different depending on the area or country you live in. Things are generally more expensive to buy in London South, get less for your money. Do you discuss the impact of this in the report? We don't, because we focus on this aspect of disposable income that people have left over to spend on anything to raise their living standards. Now that doesn't count the different kinds of consumption that people do. We leave that as a choice, as this is what people do to raise their living standards. So it is true that things are more expensive in London South. I mean, and this is why we bring out the housing point, which is probably the biggest variation in prices of expenditures across the country. But yeah, we on other things we don't, just because that will factor in, but it will factor in less. And if you want to know the kind of wholesale large ticket variation in living standards, just looking at that disposable income before different types of spending, it will tell you most of the picture. Now that might compress slightly in, if you factored in these regional price differences, but I think what we're interested in is, what is the starting point? What are the funds, the proceeds people have to raise their standards of living? And finally, I'll quickly tackle this one. How do you account for people that live in one city and work in another? Unfortunately, with this data, we can't. So we're looking at the economic performance side from a workplace perspective, but then, does that feed through into residents, enjoying those proceeds? Which is why, we see places like, I think, in the top left there was Blackpool. Presumably lots of residents there go on work in places like Liverpool and Manchester. It's the same you see for Southend and Basildon and the Greater Southeast. And then similarly, you get places that have good economic performance, places like Cambridge and Reading, where clearly lots of people commute in from outside, but the local residents don't enjoy the proceeds. Now, that's not just explaining away the disconnection there, because then you've still got an issue of, okay, you as a city council have this local economic performance, but your direct residents, your residents in the actual urban area are not accessing that. So that then requires some sort of policy intervention. How do you reconnect that? Is that through employment, skills, etc.? Anyway, I'm out of time. Thank you for joining and all your questions, and look forward to seeing you on the next one. Thank you very much.